So, good morning, everybody. I will wait a second until translation is fixed for everyone. Everyone's ready? So again, good morning, everybody. My name is Christian Gebel. I'm working for German Farmers Association. Before introducing myself a bit more, I'd like to add one point to what Mr. Gier already said, and coming back to your questions at the end. There are three important EU institutions, the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council, who are responsible to find common basic rules to keep common agricultural policy support common. And then there is the proposal of the new delivery model, which offers the member states the possibility to find some flexibilities, to find some regional implementation rules to take into account the different situations, also in the Czech Republic, also when it comes to Germany, between North and South, East and West. And it's a mixture of everything that the European Union institutions have the responsibility to keep the CAP common, and that the member states have the task and the important task to use their flexibility to recognize different situations in the regions. That's pretty important, and every one of us sitting here in the podium, you as well, are responsible to communicate our demands and our problems which we have on the field. Coming back to my presentation, Christian Gebel, my name. I'm working for German Farmers Associations now 7 years. I'm an educated farmer. I studied agricultural economics and agricultural policy. I was working in Brussels now 3 years. I recently got back to Berlin, representing our interests from Berlin, and I'm responsible for the Department of Common Agricultural Policy within the Deutscher Bauernverband, German Farmers Association. And we, as DBV, we are the umbrella organization of 18 regional farmers associations and 45 associated members out of agribusiness. And in this kind of network, we are representing around 300,000 German farmers, taking also into account those kind of farmers having an agriculture area below 5 hectares. This is more or less a little bit the background, and I'm not a scientist, but coming to the study, it is already 2 years old. Two important persons, Mr. Dr. Nulepa and also Mr. Professor Karl, and they did the work on this study, Cost of European Environmental Standards and Additional Regulations for German Agriculture. And we, as DBV, we had initiated this kind of study, and it was financed by one of our partners. But I'm here to present the main results. I'm trying to be quick as possible, and keeping you informed about the main numbers. This was a situation in 2017 when we were right in the middle of preparing our positions on the future CAP. So I'm not a scientist, I'm just giving you the information about the results of this study, and it's kind of important to take into account. So two main persons I already mentioned, Mr. Nulepa and also Mr. Karl from institutions in Germany did this study. There's a main institute, the HFFA Research Institute from Berlin. They did the whole work of the study. And now I'd like to set the scene a little bit, speaking for them and introducing you the results. What was the situation there? So CAP was and is still discussed how it could work in the future, and it's of course we already heard it in a very high political and societal public debate. The term public money only for public goods is in a high high interest of media, but is not really known pretty well when it comes to costs. There are costs, of course, caused a little bit by farming, but there are also costs caused for the environment. Went into farmers, but also out of farming. And this kind of costs farmers do have when already providing environmental and climate services are not really taken into account in this kind of discussion. So the study, and it's better to say that it was and is still a very complicated and difficult project to identify those kind of costs, had firstly some main objectives to do a comprehensive analysis of the additional costs for German farmers, and when doing that, keeping into account that there is a second step of this kind of comprehensive analysis to compare this kind of environmental costs also with the situations for competitor farmers out of EU members and countries. What the study does not include is a comparison between those kind of environmental costs farmers are causing by their agricultural activity and those kind of costs farmers do have when they fulfill some environmental services. This is not an aim and objective of this study. So I already mentioned comprehensive analysis, and after that the researchers did projections on the entire agricultural sector in Germany, but they also did projections on the average agricultural farms. What are these kinds of costs to be associated with standards and regulations coming out of European Union regulation? This is firstly additional production costs, for example, caused by changing input use, but this is also secondly lower market revenues, for example, caused by reduced productivity of farming. Then the researchers did also some own calculations, which were rather conservative, and they used only data in their comprehensive analysis already existing from scientific research. So, also important to mention is that there were different categories of standards. There were standards and regulations which were quantifiable, but there were also, this is the last point, standards and regulations whose costs were not really calculable or identifiable due to the lack of statistics. But the study includes 7 different main categories of EU environmental regulation standards. You all know the European Union Water Framework Directive. You may have heard about our German discussion about the new German fertilizer ordinance. This was a process in 2016-17. Now in 2019 we are also already discussing about the next novel of this fertilizer ordinance, but this comes out of the Water Framework Directive as well. The third point and this third category of standards and regulations was additional legislation on plant protection, especially when it comes to the regulation 1107. And this concerns the placing of plant production products on the market. The fourth category of this study was specific standards and regulations regarding livestock farming. The next category was especially costs out of bureaucracy to fulfill European developed standards, and some bureaucracy costs coming out of the fulfillment of cross-compliance regulations. Then there's this kind of small category, the fulfillment of the greening requirements. And the last category of costs was the pending amendment of the German technical instruction on air quality. So if you look into these 7 categories, you may see that this is more or less especially focused on this part and kind of implementation of European-based requirements for the German farmers. So the results from the study are 2 years old, and so far it's still complicated to do a similar study, for example, on a European Union level. But together also we do our best maybe to have sometime a European level study on this kind of issues. But keep in mind that we have 27, 28 member states, that each national implementation is kind of different also when it comes to these 7 categories. Examples for those kind of cost drivers which are not included in this study are mentioned here. For example, the potential ban on various active ingredients for chemical plant protection. Of course, on European level, we are discussing more and more about a ban of different ingredients for PPPs. Yeah, those kind of open discussions are not included in the study. There's also the debate on additional animal welfare measures. Of course, we will have additional animal welfare requirements coming out of national, also European level. Those kind of open debated costs are not included as well. And when it comes to greening, also crop diversification, and for example, the ban on plant protection measures of some greening requirements is also not included. Further aspects who were not included in this study is, for example, what we have in Germany, like social standards, the requirement to have a fixed minimum wage for the employees in agriculture, and also non-remunerated agricultural services. For example, preserving open landscapes is also not included in the study. But we know from our German 20 years old different research studies on those kind of services regarding preserving open landscape, that the willingness to pay communicated by the consumer and the residents is high, but at the end this could not really be measured. It could only be measured at in the supermarket. So now I would go through the 7 different categories, but don't be afraid. You will receive all the information to read out the slides. That's of course no problem. And I have to excuse that I don't have Czech language slides. So I would like to highlight the main numbers in the next slides, which means that the main numbers in the slides are only based on a yearly basis. So every number in the slides means that this is the cost per year on several levels. So when it comes to the European Water Framework Directive, there is a substantial study already existing for our federal state, North Rhine-Westphalia, and this agricultural structure is really good comparable to the whole German landscape, and that means that this study could be used to make an extra extrapolation of these results on the whole German country. So coming out of the analysis from the European Water Framework Directive, we have to take into account that German agriculture has cost to fulfill this directive of an amount of 1.54 billion euros per year, which means around 92 euro per hectare. The next was the analysis of the German fertilizer ordinance. Again, the novel from 2017. Now 2019 we have a new novel, and also the discussion between Germany and the European Commission. The costs to fulfill the German fertilizer ordinance are calculated with around 0.5 billion euro. And if you look into several crops, the researchers analyzed also several crops like wheat, barley. You can see that the costs euro per hectare vary between 22 euros per hectare and also when it comes to silage maize with 63 euro per hectare. So it's a little bit different between the commodities. This was the German fertilizer ordinance. Then the analysis within the study of costs of additional legislation and on plant protection, especially when it comes to the requirements under the 1107 regulation. There is an existing study which cumulated effects of the regulation cut-off criteria with 2.4 billion euro. But the researchers came to the conclusion that this is kind of a too pessimistic calculation. So they focused on the neonicotinoids and also on the endocrine effects, ingredients with endocrine effects, and they came to the conclusion that additional legislation on plant protection costs for German farmers can be calculated to 1.12 billion euro, which is, you can see below this amount, which is a little bit too high to think about it realistically. And if you look into different crops, wheat, barley, corn, oilseed rape, potato, sugar beet, you can see the neonicotinoids and also the ingredients with endocrine effects, the EDs. You can see how the costs are separated in the amount with the millions here. Of course, the whole sector in Germany. When it comes to those kind of analyzed standards and regulations regarding livestock farming, animal welfare, the researchers came to the conclusion that this kind of costs amount to around 0.7 billion euro for the whole agribusiness for the farmers in Germany. Which means that the core costs of this amount are existing within the pork producers, with then 142 million euro per year in the milk producing sector and 82 million euro per year within the beef producers. Last but not least, the poultry industry and the poultry farmers with costs of 72 billion euros per year. And you can see the different costs in the sectors: milk, beef, pork and poultry, which is from 6 euro per ton milk up to 72 euro per ton slaughter weight within the pork meat. then I would like to keep it short in this way. The costs for bureaucracy and cross-compliance and different, let's say, paperwork issued by European Union regulation is calculated from the researchers with up to 260 million euro per year. This is the the fifth part. Then you have the costs for greening. So the costs, as I mentioned, without crop diversification and the maintenance of permanent grassland, only focused on ecological focus areas. And then there are additional costs of the ban converting grassland to arable land, which are calculated up. In the sum up, there are costs of 0.9 billion euro per year for the overall German agricultural sector out of the greening, as I mentioned here. And you can see that especially wheat producers and oilseed rape, as well as green fodder producers, are especially affected due to this requirement of ecological focus areas. Then we have a more or less German national debate and discussion about the technical instructions on air quality. That means that the analysis in the study showed that pig fattening farmers have costs per place from around 20 euro. The pig breeding farmers, they have costs. It's better to give specters not to fix on a several amount. The analysis showed that it's a large variety of costs. So here you can see for the pig breeding producers costs of around 20 to 50 euros per place. It varies, of course. And if you look into the cattle farming, not really quantifiable costs existing. So if you compare the overall amount of 0.31 billion euro per year for the farmers out of the technical instruction on air quality, and you can see that pig fattening, of course, with 240 million euros per year is affected pretty well. So this is more or less maybe this kind of slide showing you the core amount the researchers calculated in their study. I heard that, some people were wondering about the high amount, but the overall sum up of the 7 categories showed that German farmers are having costs of 5.2 billion euros to fulfill the already existing environmental and climate requirements, and therefore also taking a different communication way, saying that these kind of agricultural services are worth it in this amount. So these are costs per hectare from around 315 euro. This is the main result of the comprehensive analysis. And in the graph, you can see the different categories they analyzed, so 7 at the end, showing that the costs for fulfillment of the Water Framework Directive are the largest part, and also the non-approval of plant protection products is also a very high affecting issue in this analysis. So if you make the calculation, the aggregated costs for specific average farms for our German agriculture, you can say that a full-time family farm has to anticipate costs of around 28,000 euro per year, which means around 367 euro per hectare. And in the column, you can see how it is separated in the different categories. if you take into account and if you do the aggregated costs analysis for a corporate identity and corporate entity as we have it especially in my home region in East Germany as well as here in Czech Republic, then you can say that an average corporate entity in Germany is burdened with around 400,000 euros per year, which means per hectare around 356 euro. Then there was a third part of this kind of aggregation to look into full-time family farm producing milk and beef. There the researchers came to the conclusion that they have costs of around 280 euros per hectare. So this was more or less the first part of the study, firstly to set the scene and to identify the current situation on costs of environmental and climate standards as it is in Germany within 2017. Now the second part of the study was to find ways and methodology to compare this kind of situation for German agriculture with those kind of non-European Union and competitors in different countries. And yeah, I will continue and I try to be quick. Firstly, you have to take into account that data research and data collection was quite difficult, also for especially for those countries with from South America. Also, when it comes to Asian countries, it was kind of difficult to find valid data to do this analysis. But the researchers found a way based on field cases and several and different field cases. So they analyzed the costs differences in selected competitor countries, and they focused and had the chance to analyze the data for the categories Water Framework Directive, animal husbandry, livestock farming, animal welfare, as well as food safety. And if you take this categories of environmental and climate standards into account, you can see a comparison for the milk sector, the beef sector, the pork meat sector, also poultry and wheat sector. In the first column here, you have the costs for German farmers. In the milk production, for example, 6 euros per ton, but compared to the competitor here in this case, a farmer from Australia has only costs of around 2 euros per ton. And another competitor country is New Zealand, in this case, with cost of 2.63 euro per ton. And every time connected to these three categories: Water Framework Directive, animal husbandry, and food safety. Coming back to our discussion on Mercosur, for example, it's interesting to look in this pork meat line. German farmers have costs of around 154 euros per ton slaughter weight, but Brazilian farmers only have costs of 42 euros per ton. Taking another example, comparing German and Brazilian farmers is the beef sector. For example, here German farmers have costs of around 71 euro per ton slaughter weight. Brazilian farmers, this is a different information, have costs of 102 euro. So it it kind of brings a little bit more knowledge into the Mercosur discussion. Taking a third field case analysis into account is the poultry meat sector. There, German farmers have 27 euro per ton slaughter weight of costs, but Brazilian, you can see the difference is pretty large. And this kind of field case analysis was made on several commodities, several main products, and of course the main and most important competitor countries, competitors for especially German farmers when it comes to agricultural trade. This is another example here, the example that the compliance with country-specific standards in competitor countries here in cattle farming costs for livestock unit in Germany of 182 euros, but only corresponding costs in Australia in this field case of 30 to 60 euros. You can see it here, the slide for a forage farmer in Germany compared to a cattle farmer in South Australia and compared to a cattle farmer in North Australia. When you look into poultry production in Germany, 90 cents per kilogram live weight compared to 9 to 15 cents per kilogram live weight for non-competitor countries. Yeah, so this was only a small spot of field cases of the study, but at the end there are some main information behind those field cases and the trial to compare the situation of German farmers with the non-EU competitors. So the conclusion has to be that comparable standards are weaker outside the European Union, and that the compliance costs for this European standards, if they are compared in the situations of outside the EU, are lower than in Germany. And the last point in this slide I will show is very important, is that some of the costs we have in Germany are not existent outside the European Union, which especially means the categories of German fertilizer regulation, the 1107 regulation, the greening, and also our discussion about air quality regulation, as well as, that's a separate topic, this topic of direct payments. So there are some European origin regulations and standards not really comparable because they are not existing outside the EU. So again, the amount of a little bit more than 5.2 billion euro per year for German farmers. In non-EU countries, more than 3 billion euro of these costs do not occur. As I said, that there are various specific standards and regulations not existing outside the EU. And the costs in those compared non-EU competitor countries for the remaining comparable standards are significantly lower. But the next slide shows maybe it a little bit more. I would like to guide you to ignore the middle column and the middle bullet point, because it's a little bit too complicated. But as you remember, the amount of 315 euro is the amount of 315 euro per hectare associated with standards and regulations in Germany and for German farmers. If those kind of comparable standards and regulations the third point, so the burden on German farmers when considering cost differences of the remaining and comparable standards in those compared farmers in countries outside of the EU, this kind of costs are only 65 euro per hectare. So this is the large difference between the situations for a German farmer and a non-EU competitor farmer, which means the difference calculated on the aggregated level is around 4 billion euro. Coming to a short conclusion before leaving a little bit space maybe for questions. The cost of complying for those kind of EU-based standards and regulations for German agriculture are considerable burden to those non-EU competitor countries. This is, of course, a not marginal disadvantage for the farmers and has to be taken into account when talking about CAP and talking about direct payments and talking about costs farmers are causing for the environment by their agricultural activity, and also taking this kind of analysis especially into account when we should say that farmers and agriculture is already delivering a lot within those standards. And finally, one remark is that it should be in every hour of our discussions no issue to ignore the fact that we are willing to deliver. But at the end, it should be honest. And maybe coming to this point, German farmers stand by the high European and German standards for agriculture and food production without any doubt. And this should be our guiding thought for the future, also when we are discussing about Mercosur. I think Mercosur is not only a negative fact, it's also a positive fact, I guess, when it comes to the chance and opportunity that we could be able to implement our high European standards, maybe also in foreign markets. And this could be our positive chance behind Mercosur. So at the end, this was the kind of study was a contribution from our side into the public debate. It should be not ignored in the discussion. And the study also showed that there is a lack of information to compare the concrete market situations in competitor countries within the EU, but also especially without outside of the EU. And the study is now 2 years old. And I think some farmers' organizations have thought about doing a similar study. So far, I heard not from any different result in member states, but it should be a target for the future, as I can say here in this round, the farming community, to work on those analyses, that we have information about how the situation is here in Europe, is in Germany, is also in Czech Republic, and maybe it will lead to the fact that also our non-agricultural consumer is knowing a little bit more about those kind of environmental services we are already delivering. And so far, I would keep it to that because we are quite late now. But I'm really open for questions. This was only a small part of my daily work. My daily work is more or less the concrete and detailed CAP regulation. And if you have any questions on our German CAP strategic planning, here we go. Thank you.
Takže já poděkuji.